welcome to Gisela and Elizabeth from Latin American Women's Rights Service, or LAWRS. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Could you just please start by telling me a bit about who LAWRS are and what the work that you both do there is?
So LAWRS is a buy-in for Latin American migrant women's organization. We are obviously based on feminist and human rights principles, and we work in two interconnected levels, which is the practical and the strategic. The practical, we support women through advice and counseling. We cover areas of violence against women and girls, quite obviously, including, domestic abuse, harmful practices, and the rest. But we also, understanding the needs of migrant women, support them in areas of generalist advice, which covers welfare benefits, housing, homelessness, debt, that kind of thing, as well as unemployment rights, including from labor exploitation to human trafficking and modern slavery and sexual exploitation. So we also complement the practical work done with women on the ground with strategic work, which is our policy advocacy and campaigning work, in which we cover areas of violence against women and girls and employment rights generally. But because of the interconnectedness of issues of migrant women, we have been quite active in areas, for example, now with the coronavirus, about inequalities based on race and ethnic minorities, as well as access to healthcare, data sharing, and the rest. So even though we specialize in these two areas, in reality, we try to cover the whole experience of migrant women in this country and the whole disadvantages affecting our community, but other communities who, like us, are disadvantaged on the basis of their gender, intersecting with their race, their ethnic minority status, class, and the rest. So it's a lot, to be quite honest, and we try and cover as much as possible, because we know that migrant women are one of the most unheard voices, while being one of the most vulnerable positions to have in the UK these days.
Great. Elizabeth, is there anything you'd like to add?
I guess the only thing I would say, and this is more like a personal reflection, when I think who is LAWRS, I think LAWRS is our service users, LAWRS, it's our colleagues, LAWRS is the migrant women we support, and that's fantastic, because we are an organization from the policy perspective. We are an organization that does policy from the front line. So one of our main objectives by doing policy is to give voice and to influence decision making from the experiences of the front line.
That's great, thank you. Really, lovely way to think about the organization. And it's amazing to hear about the breadth of work that you do with migrant women. You're right, you really do cover a lot, and it's amazing work. Leading on from that, could you just explain a little bit what are the limitations around the Domestic Abuse Act that came into law earlier this year in relation to migrant women from your perspective?
Yes, so I guess just to give a little bit of context, as you might be aware, this bill was presented as this once-in-a-generation opportunity to tackle domestic abuse. This was the language from the government, and it was a really long process to make this bill. It took so many years, and many organizations, many stakeholders from the sector were quite concerned that it took so long, when this should be a priority, right? Because of the prevalence of this specific crime, but also because it happened to, the last process of the bill, it happened to be at the same time of the coronavirus crisis, when domestic abuse cases were increasing, right? So I think in this same context, it's important to mention that there were some provisions to celebrate. We campaigned during the process of the bill, and we know other organizations did the same. And there are some provisions in this new act that are to celebrate. We were really we were really happy to see that, for instance, children were recognized as victims of domestic abuse on their own right. Post-separation abuse was recognized as a form of abuse because many of our service users might experience this. But sadly, despite the many efforts we did as an organization campaigning, the government did not consider the provision of some of these measures to migrant women. So what it's really sad is that while we celebrate that some of these provisions are available for victims of domestic abuse, none of these would apply for victims with insecure immigration status and no access to public funds. So one of the new provisions that has been really mentioned by the sector is the obligation of local authorities to provide safe accommodation for victims of domestic abuse, which we think should be a priority by statutory services, local authorities. But sadly, this doesn't cover one of the most vulnerable groups of victims, that it's women with no recourse to public funds. And what took us, not really took us, but what was quite complex was the issue that we presented as this bill was developing a wealth of evidence on the specific needs. We are, as I said, we work with a particular vulnerable group of victims whose immigration status become a risk factor for them to experience longer periods of abuse and exacerbates their vulnerability to become victims. And what it's really sad is that despite the government saying that this is a piece of legislation to protect victims, it didn't consider the specific needs of migrant women. And despite the evidence we presented, the government said that they needed to assess the need. And this is quite frustrating as a frontline organization because every day we support women who are really vulnerable and who are turned away from life-saving support. So while we celebrate, for instance, the fact that children are recognized on their own right as victims of abuse, this might not apply for victims, children victims with insecure immigration status. So what we have said many times is that this bill ended up creating a two-tier system. So when migrant victims, especially those with no recourse to public funds, those with insecure immigration status, approach a first responder, it can be the police or statutory services, they are turned away. They are said that they cannot be protected because of their immigration status, and their immigration status takes prevalence. So we were really disappointed that despite the many efforts we made in influencing and the support, because there was cross-party support to the amendments we were presenting, at the end the government decided to go for this pilot project that it's quite problematic because of many issues, because it doesn't provide holistic support, wraparound support. It only covers a really reduced number of migrant women with no recourse to public funds. And yeah, I think in general, that's what I would say. The bill was presented by the government as this once in a generation opportunity. There were some provisions to celebrate, but sadly for the women we support, these provisions are not applicable.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really shocking to hear the extent of how the two-tier system, like you said, it's actually played out in reality for those really vulnerable women with insecure immigration status. And I think that you started to touch on this a bit, but could you just go into a bit more detail, either of you, about what the real impact of this, of the lack of protection in the Act, is on migrant women themselves and Latin American women in particular in the UK now, and how you're seeing that in your work?
So I guess if we had to summarize some of the impacts, some of them I already mentioned, but it's the fact that these women are turned away from life-saving provisions. This applies to refuge accommodation, but this also applies, for instance, to reporting to the police, because there's not a clear separation between reporting a crime, accessing support, and different forms of immigration control, because currently there are some data sharing schemes between the police, statutory services, and the Home Office for immigration control as part of the hostile environment. So that means women don't feel confident to approach for support, for safety. And when they do so, they are turned away and they are re-victimized and exposed to further abuse. This as well increases the vulnerability of already marginalized group of victims who face structural intersecting barriers to protection, as migrant women are. So that means the bill is not complying with its objective to protect and to tackle domestic abuse for this specific group of victims. But I think something we mentioned many times as we participated in this process of the scrutiny of the bill is that this bill sends a really, really concerning message to perpetrators that abusing migrant women can be done without being held accountable. But there's not going to be consequences if they abuse migrant women, because these women are going to be, they won't be believed because of their immigration status, and they won't be provided any support. For instance, accommodation, for instance, access to the possibility of reporting a crime safely. So this is something really, really concerning, because perpetrators know they can abuse with impunity. And I think something else, something that we have seen now with the bill is that as migrant women and those with no recourse to public funds in secure immigration status are not part of this bill, statutory services are telling the women we support that they don't have an obligation to support them. So we have seen this happening with undocumented migrants in many cases, without, for instance, understanding how they became undocumented as part of the abuse. This happens frequently. This often happens to the women we support, because perpetrators know that by controlling their immigration status, they have power over these victims and they can continue abusing. So if I had to summarize, I would say these are some of the main consequences we have seen of the exclusion of migrant women from the bill. But I don't know, Gisela, if you think something.
I think you have covered everything. I would just potentially add that for migrant women, there is no before and after the bill. I mean, their situation continues to be the same. So these bills having no impact whatsoever on their lives, except on that exclusion that now has become entrenched in legislation, because now there is this statute in the books that actually allows statutory services to turn women away because they're just specifically not included. And this has an impact on rights, as Elizabeth was mentioning, that they might have through other legislation and through other regulations. And I think Section 17 is the most obvious case, where you have British children by virtue of the nationality of their father, whose mother cannot access accommodation to escape the abuse, that they have a right as children in accessing because of their immigration status. And it leads to incredibly ridiculous situations as councils and local authorities making this decision with the financial controller making the ultimate decision instead of social services doing what they need to be doing, which is protecting both mothers and children who need to be protected. So it just reinforces in the mind of statutory services that migrant women are to be excluded from every sort of protection. From a very practical point of view of being a frontline service, this creates massive problems even for ourselves, because it means that our caseworkers are going to have to devote a lot more time explaining to officials in statutory services what the rights of the survivor are. And that means that instead of seeing many more women that have come forward as a result of, you know, COVID and the lockdowns and the rest, we're having to devote more and more time explaining to statutory services what they need to be doing to support these women. In some cases, we have seen very dramatic relocations of women to access support, particular accommodation, which also disrupts whatever support networks they might have in the locality, disrupts the lives of children who might not need to access schooling and education and the rest. And the cases coming through the service are quite frankly unbelievable in the level of dehumanizing of migrant women when they come in contact with statutory services. And to give you one of very many examples, I think one of the most shocking ones that has stayed with me was a social services official making a visit to a pregnant woman and her partner, where it was very clear that the woman was sleeping on the floor. There was no food in the fridge. There was nothing available. This person is looking at this situation. She's asking the perpetrator, you know, where does she sleep? And he, quite frankly, just replied, on the floor. I mean, there was no even an intention of covering up what the situation was, because the result of that was social services was quite satisfied that this was the conditions that this pregnant woman, you know, was to be living in. So what is the point in trying to protect survivors of domestic abuse when you have this group of survivors whose humanity is completely lost to statutory services, because legislation essentially gives them the rationale to say, we're not including migrant women, they're completely excluded, so this is not a problem of the state.
If I can just add something very quick in there, Laura, I think one of the arguments that became repeated by the government as the scrutiny of the bill passed, and that continues to be quite frustrating, is the idea of migrant women abusing the system and pretending to be victims of domestic abuse in order to access immigration status, for instance. And I think this perception that it's permeated by the hostile environment, it's really clear when women approach social services, when they approach statutory services in general, because as I mentioned before, women are often disbelieved. They are seen as migrants before being seen as victims. They are seen not only as migrants, as possible immigration offenders. This has been the approach from the police for many years now. So I think when the bill was received royal assent without any protection for migrant women, this argument kind of became stronger in terms of, we don't believe you. We don't believe the evidence that you presented as part of this scrutiny process. We need to make sure that you are not trying to game the system. And this, as a frontline organization, becomes so difficult to hear, so frustrating at the same time, because we are the ones supporting these women at the front line. Our colleagues, Gisela mentioned this, the work of our colleagues, the work that they have, the time they have to invest in supporting these particular cases of women, it's huge, because they are fighting the system, a system that sees the victim as a potential immigration offender, that sees the victim as someone who's trying to game the system to get immigration status, but who in reality is at huge risk, in many times with children, at risk of become destitute, at risk of further abuse, at risk of being murdered, because the abuse increases, the forms of abuse they experience increase in terms of forms and how many times it happens. So this, I think, in the context of the debates of the Domestic Abuse Act now, was really, really hard to go through as an organization leading on this amendment.
Thank you for outlining the full extent of God, the many, many damaging impacts of the Act on migrant women. And it's very shocking and horrifying to hear how kind of the Act sort of legitimized statutory services, seeing migrant women as second-class citizens almost, and that it has actually made their lived experiences and their access to rights worse. So thank you for explaining that and for going into such detail.